The metal collar was already locked around my neck when the guards dragged me onto the ledge above the Kell River. My knees scraped raw from the stone path behind us, and the weight hanging from the collar told me exactly how this was supposed to end. Below me the river ran wide and dark, moving slower than it should have for this time of year, almost as if it already knew what it was about to receive. Behind me, on the far bank, hundreds of Naveen stood in tight rows with their heads bowed, whispering the same name again and again, low and steady, like a drumbeat that never stopped. Vale. Threll stood beside me with his arms crossed, watching my face the way he always did before an execution, waiting to see fear crack through it. He was the Dravani officer in charge of this camp, and in 3 years he had never once missed a chance to remind every human here exactly how small we were supposed to feel. This was the 4th execution I had watched from this exact stretch of shoreline, though it was the first time I had ever stood on the wrong side of the chains. "You could have stayed quiet," he said, his voice calm in a way that made it worse. "You could have let the boat burn and gone back to your work detail like everyone else did." "The boy is 11, I said. "He didn't miss his quota because he was lazy. He missed it because the nets are too heavy for him to pull alone." Threll tilted his head, almost amused. "That was never the question I asked you to answer." I didn't say anything else after that. There was nothing left to say that would change what was about to happen, and I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of hearing my voice shake in front of 400 witnesses. Somewhere in the line of prisoners brought out to watch, I heard Milo shout my name once before a guard's hand clamped over his mouth and dragged him back a step. I didn't turn to look. If I turned, I was afraid my legs would stop working, and I wanted to do this last part standing up straight. Threll gave a short nod, and the 2 guards flanking me shoved me forward at the same time. There was no ledge left under my feet after that. Only air, and then only water, and then only cold. It hit me harder than I expected, a solid wall of cold that punched the breath out of my chest before I even understood I was under the surface. The weight bolted to my collar pulled me down fast, feet first, spinning me slightly as the pale light above me shrank into a small, shivering circle. I clawed uselessly at the collar with fingers already going numb, knowing even as I did it that there was no clasp my hands could reach, nothing left to do but sink and wait for my body to decide it was finished fighting. My ears filled with a dull roar, my chest burned before I had even managed to hold my breath properly, and somewhere underneath the rising panic, my mind reached for the only thing it had left to hold on to, which wasn't a prayer and wasn't a plan. It was a boy named Tarn, standing on a splintered dock 3 days earlier, trying to lift a net twice his size. I used to walk past that dock on the way to the timber yard every morning, and most mornings Tarn was already out there struggling with ropes that should have needed 2 grown men to manage. I started stopping to help without asking permission from anyone, because permission was never going to be the point. His mother would nod at me without a word, since neither of us could risk being seen talking too long, and his father had died the year before in a mining accident nobody had bothered to investigate. Tarn asked me once, in the careful, hopeful way only a child can manage, whether humans had rivers like this back where I came from. I told him we did, though none of ours had anything living in them that the whole world was afraid of. He said that sounded lonely. I didn't have an answer for that either. 3 days before the ledge, Threll's inspection crew arrived at the dock to condemn the boat as an example, ready to break the hull apart piece by piece in front of the whole family. I stood between them and the boat and told them they would have to go through me first, because it was the only thing I had left to offer. They didn't touch the boat that day. They used a baton across my back instead, and I still finished my full shift afterward, because collapsing right there would only have meant someone else ended up standing on this ledge in my place. It still felt like the right decision, even sinking, even chained, even with my lungs starting to scream for air that wasn't coming. The cold kept pulling me deeper, and just as my vision started to blur at the edges, another memory pushed its way up, one I had never told anyone. Not even Milo. 3 months before that morning, I found something small and broken in the reeds along the riverbank during a work shift, tangled so tightly in a torn fishing net that it could barely twitch. I had no idea what it was. Humans were forbidden from getting near the water without an escort, and every Naveen laborer I had ever asked about the river went quiet and strange the moment the question left my mouth. But the creature in the net was shaking, its skin the deep gray of wet stone, and when it finally lifted its head to look at me, its eyes were a deep copper color with thin black pupils that seemed far too old for something so small. Its breathing came out in small, uneven clicks, and every muscle beneath its skin seemed to tense at once, bracing for whatever I was about to do to it, the way anything learns to brace after enough people have already done the wrong thing. I cut it free anyway. It didn't bite the hand doing the cutting. It just watched me, breathing hard, deciding something. I wrapped it in my own jacket and carried it back to camp hidden against my chest, and for 3 weeks, I kept it in an old storage crate behind the medical tent, feeding it scraps from my own rations at night, and cleaning the gash along its front leg with supplies I told Grace, the camp medic, that I had lost. Grace was far too sharp to believe that story, but she never asked what I was actually doing with the missing antiseptic, and she never reported it either, which was its own quiet kind of courage in a camp where reporting your neighbor was the easiest way to earn an extra ration. By the second week it had stopped flinching every time I reached toward it, and one night it pressed its head into my palm on its own, a small, deliberate motion that meant more to me than I expected it to. A guard nearly found the crate during a routine sweep a few nights later, and I stood in front of it pretending to fix a broken hinge until he lost interest and walked away, my heart slamming so hard I thought he would hear it through my ribs. By the time it was strong enough to shove its way out of a container twice its size, I carried it back to the river at midnight and let it go without ever learning its name or its species, or whether I had just committed the single most reckless act of my life. It hesitated at the waterline for a moment, looking back at me the way it had looked at me that very first night in the reeds, before finally sliding beneath the surface without a sound. I stood there longer than I should have, half expecting it to resurface, half hoping it wouldn't, because if it did, I wasn't sure I would have the will to leave it there a second time. I never told anyone afterward. Some things you keep to yourself because saying them out loud only gets someone killed. Somewhere underneath even that memory was an older one, 3 years old now, from the day Dravani's ships first broke through Earth's orbital defenses, and it became clear within a single afternoon that the war everyone had been bracing for was already over before it properly began. I remembered the transport that carried me and thousands of others away from a planet I never got to say goodbye to, and the quiet, humbling relief of realizing survival simply meant obedience. I still remembered the exact color of the sky that last morning, a soft gray that meant rain was coming, and I remembered thinking, foolishly, that I would see that sky again by evening. I never got the chance to find out if I was right. Down here, chained and sinking with my lungs on fire, and the light above me almost gone, I wondered whether letting Vael go, or stepping in front of that boat, had been the most foolish thing I had ever done, or the only good one. Then the water around me moved. Not the slow shifting of current, but something enormous pushing through the dark, displacing everything around it at once. For half a second, before my mind caught up to what was happening, I saw the vague outline of something long and ridged moving beneath me, larger than any living thing had a right to be, blotting out what little light reached this deep. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to thrash, to fight, to do anything, except hang there helpless in the black water. Instead, without deciding to, I went completely still. Something wide and solid slid underneath me, not with teeth, not with the crushing grip I had braced myself for, but gently, the way you would slide a hand under something you didn't want to drop. 2 sharp cracks followed, one after another, and the weight dragging me toward the riverbed was gone. The chains had snapped clean off the collar. I didn't understand what was happening until I felt myself rising instead of sinking, lifted on the broad back of something the size of a transport barge, and my head broke the surface into cold air and burning lungs, and a silence on the riverbank so complete, it felt louder than any sound could have. Water streamed off a back wide enough to hold 3 grown men standing shoulder to shoulder, ridged along the spine like old stone, with faint steam rising where the cold river met warmer air. 400 Naveen stood frozen on the shore. Every guard beside Threll stood frozen too, and the creature beneath me turned its head slightly to look at me, its eyes the same deep copper, a pale scar running along its front leg exactly where a torn net had once cut too deep. I understood then what everyone else on that riverbank was only beginning to understand. This was Vael, and Vael remembered me. For a long moment nobody moved, not the guards, not the Naveen, not even the river itself, which had gone still around us as if it were holding its breath along with everyone else. An old woman near the front of the crowd sank to her knees without seeming to decide to. A guard's spear tip dipped toward the ground before he caught himself and straightened it again. Then Threll's voice cut through the silence, sharp and furious, ordering his guards to pull me out of the water and finish what the river hadn't. 2 of them started forward at once, weapons raised, boots splashing into the shallows. Vael didn't move against them. It didn't need to. It simply stayed exactly where it was, massive and calm beneath me, close enough to the shoreline that the guard's next step would put them well within reach of something none of them wanted to test. I found my voice for the first time since Threll had asked me his question on the ledge. "Nobody needs to test this," I said, loud enough for the whole riverbank to hear. "Put the weapons down, and nobody has to find out what happens next." Threll turned on me, his composure cracking for the first time in 3 years. "You don't give orders here." "I'm not giving one," I said. I'm asking you to think about what 400 witnesses are about to watch you do." My legs were shaking under me, and I was fairly sure I would collapse the moment Vale moved out from under me, but I kept my eyes on Threll anyway, because looking away first felt like the one thing I still had control over. The two guards in the shallows glanced at him, waiting for an order. He did not give one, not yet, and in the silence that followed I understood that even he was no longer entirely sure what the right order was. That was when Mireille stepped forward. She was the oldest of the Naveen elders, small and steady, and she walked straight between the guards and the water with both hands raised, speaking in a voice that carried without needing to be loud. I didn't understand every word of the old dialect she used, but I understood its shape well enough, a warning, a boundary, a line she was daring anyone to cross. Behind her, the rest of the crowd began moving too, not violently, just steadily, filling the space between the guards and the river, until there was nowhere left for anyone to push forward without pushing through hundreds of people at once. A young Naveen boy, no older than Tarn, slipped out from behind his mother's legs and walked to stand beside Mireille before anyone could stop him, his small hands balled into fists at his sides. Nobody pulled him back. Threll shouted at them to move aside. Nobody did. He turned toward Mireille directly, his voice dropping into something colder. "Your people answer to the Concord, Elder. Not to a fish story you have been telling children for 3 generations. Then explain to the Concord," Mireille said, without a trace of fear in her voice, "why their god just chose a human over their own officer." Threll opened his mouth to answer, and then seemed to realize, in front of 400 witnesses, that he did not actually have one. I have never seen a man look more furious or more powerless at the same time than Threll did in that moment, caught between an order he could not take back and a crowd that had simply stopped being afraid of him all at once. It might have ended badly right there if the transport had not arrived when it did, cutting low over the tree line with the markings of the regional command office. A senior Dravani official stepped out before the engines had even finished powering down, took one look at the standoff on the riverbank, the 400 Naveen refusing to move, the guards with weapons half raised, the massive shape of Vale still holding steady in the shallows, and understood immediately that this was no longer a simple execution. For a moment he simply studied the water, then looked back at the 400 Naveen still refusing to move, then at Threll, as if weighing which of the 3 was the actual problem he had flown in to solve. He did not ask Threll for an explanation on the spot. He simply gave him an order, quiet and final, and within the hour Threll was escorted onto that same transport and flown out of the camp for good, reassigned somewhere far enough away that nobody expected to hear his name mentioned again. I was pulled from the water not as a prisoner but as something the official clearly did not have a category for yet. For the first time in 3 years, somebody used my actual name, Ethan, instead of my prisoner number when they helped me onto dry ground. Grace reached me first, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders with hands that were shaking almost as much as mine. Milo got to me right after, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all, because there was nothing left that needed saying. When he finally spoke, all he managed was my name again, quieter this time, as if he needed to hear himself say it to believe I was still able to answer. The days after that were strange in ways I am still getting used to. Tarn's mother left a woven basket of dried fish outside my quarters the next morning without a note, though everyone in the camp already knew exactly who it was from. Tarn himself came to find me on the 4th day, said almost nothing at all, and simply sat next to me on the fence line for the better part of an hour before standing up and walking home, as if that had been the whole point of the visit. Grace finally admitted, 3 days later, that she had been so certain I was going to die that she had already written a letter to send to my family, one she never sent and still refuses to let me read. Milo, being Milo, spent the following week telling anyone who would listen that he had known all along the river creature would never touch me, conveniently forgetting how loudly he had shouted my name right before I went under. Guards who used to shove prisoners without thinking twice have started thinking twice. One of the younger guards, a quiet man who had never once spoken to me directly in 3 years, left a spare portion of dried meat on my bunk without ever admitting it was him, though I recognized his boot prints in the mud outside well enough. Other prisoners who used to keep their distance, afraid that whatever I had done to end up on that ledge might be contagious, now ask me quiet questions about Vale that I don't always know how to answer. Naveen families who once avoided eye contact with any human now nod when they pass me on the path to the timber yard. Nothing about the camp has changed on paper, but everything about how it feels has changed underneath that paper, and I believe even the regional command office knows it. 2 weeks later, once the swelling around my wrists had gone down enough to move freely again, I walked back to the riverbank alone for the first time since the ledge. I did not call out or wait for anything in particular. I simply sat on the flat rocks near the water's edge, the way I used to sit near that old storage crate months earlier, and after a while the surface broke quietly a short distance away, just enough for a pair of deep copper eyes to find mine across the water. Neither of us moved closer. We did not need to. After a few minutes it sank back beneath the surface as quietly as it had appeared, and I walked back to camp feeling lighter than I had in 3 years, not because anything about my situation had truly changed, but because for the first time since I arrived on this planet, I was certain that at least one living thing here was glad I existed. That was worth more to me than any change in my paperwork ever could be. I still do not fully understand what Veil is, or why it remembered a frightened, half-starved human who patched up its leg 3 months earlier, or whether creatures like that carry kindness the same way people do. But I know exactly what I saw in those copper eyes right before it broke my chains, and I know it was not hunger. Somewhere on Earth, whether anyone there ever hears this story or not, that same instinct is still alive in every person who has ever fed a stray animal at their back door, or helped an injured bird back into flight, expecting nothing in return except the small, quiet chance that kindness might survive long enough to be remembered. I had been thrown into that river as a warning to every human who still believed kindness was worth the risk. Instead, I climbed out of it, as proof that it always is.